Chapter 12. Tomorrow thou diest. There was a great celebration in the village of Batando the chief the night that Ulala returned. A goat was killed and many chickens, and there were fruit and cassava bread and native beer in plenty for all. There was music too and dancing, with all of which it was morning before they sought their sleeping mats, with the result that it was afternoon the following day, before Fejwan had an opportunity to speak of serious matters with Batando. When finally he sought him out, he found the old chief squatting in the shade before his hut, slightly the worse for the orgy of the preceding night. "I have come to talk with you, Batando," he said, "of the desert people." Batando grunted. His head ached. "Yesterday you said that you would lead them to the entrance to the Forbidden Valley," said Fejwan. "You mean, then, that you will not fight them?" "We shall not have to fight them if we lead them to the entrance to the Forbidden Valley," replied Batando. "You speak in riddles," said Fejwan. "Listen, Ulala," replied the old chief. "In childhood you were stolen from your people and taken from your country. Being young, there were many things you did not know, and there are others that you have forgotten. It is not difficult to enter the Forbidden Valley, especially from the north. Every Gala knows how to find the northern pass through the mountains or the tunnel beyond the Great Cross that marks the southern entrance. There are only these two ways in. Every Gala knows them, but every Gala also knows that there is no way out of the Forbidden Valley." "What do you mean, Batando?" demanded Fejwan. "If there are two ways in, there must be two ways out." "No, there is no way out," insisted the chief. "As far back as goes the memory of man or the tales of our fathers and our fathers' fathers, it is known that many men have entered the Forbidden Valley, and it is also known that no man has ever come out of it." "And why have they not come out?" Batando shook his head. "Who knows?" he asked. "We cannot even guess their fate." "What sort of people inhabit the valley?" asked Fejwan. "Not even that is known. No man has seen them and returned to tell. Some say they are the spirits of the dead, others that the valley is peopled by leopards. But no one knows. Go, therefore, Ulala, and tell the chief of the desert people that we will lead him to the entrance to the valley. If we do this, we shall not have to fight him and his people, nor shall we ever again be bothered by them." And Batando laughed at his little joke. "Will you send guides back with me to lead the Bedawi to the valley?" asked Fejwan. "No," replied the chief. "Tell them we shall come in 3 days. In the meantime I shall gather together many warriors from other villages, for I do not trust the desert people. Thus we shall conduct them through our country. Explain this to their chief, and also that in payment he must release to us all the Gala slaves he has with him before he enters the valley." "That Ibn Jad will not do," said Fejwan. "Perhaps when he sees himself surrounded by Gala warriors, he will be glad to do even more," replied Batando. And so Fejwan, the Gala slave, returned to his masters and reported all that Batando had told him to report. Ibn Jad at first refused to give up his slaves, but when Fejwan had convinced him that under no other terms would Batando lead him to the entrance to the valley, and that his refusal to liberate the slaves would invite the hostile attentions of the Galas, he finally consented. But in the back of his mind was the thought that before his promise was consummated, he might find an opportunity to evade it. Only one regret had Fejwan in betraying the Bedouins, and that was caused by his liking for Atalia. But being a fatalist, he was consoled by the conviction that whatever was to be would be, regardless of what he might do. And as Ibn Jad waited and Batando gathered his black warriors from far and near, Tarzan of the apes came to the water-hole of the smooth, round rocks and took up the trail of the Bedouins. Since he had learned from Blake's blacks that the young American was missing, and also that they had seen nothing of Stimbul since the latter had separated from Blake and started for the coast, The ape-man was more convinced than ever that the white prisoner among the Arabs was Blake. Still, he felt no great concern for the man's safety, for if the Bedouins had sufficient hopes of reward to spare his life at all, he was in no great danger from them. Reasoning thus, Tarzan made no pretense of speed as he followed the spoor of Ibn Jad and his people. Two men sat upon rough benches at opposite sides of a rude table. Between them a cresset of oil with a cotton wick laying in it burned feebly, slightly illuminating the stone flagging of the floor and casting weird shadows of themselves upon the rough stone walls. Through a narrow window, innocent of glass, the night air blew, driving the flame of the cresset now this way, now that. Upon the table between the men lay a square board blocked off into squares, and within some of these were several wooden pieces. "It is your move, Richard," said one of the men. "You don't appear to be very keen about the game tonight. What's the matter?" "I be thinking of the morrow, James, and my heart be heavy within me," replied the other. "And why?" demanded Blake. "Malud is not the best swordsman in Nimmer," replied Sir Richard, "but—" He hesitated. "I am the worst," Blake finished the sentence for him, laughingly. Sir Richard looked up and smiled. "Thou wilt always joke, even in the face of death," he said. "Art all the men of this strange country thou tell'st of alike?" "It is your move, Richard," said Blake. "Hide not his sword from thine eyes with thy buckler, James," cautioned Richard. "Ever keep thine eyes upon his eyes until thou knowest whereat he striketh. Then, with thy buckler ready, thou mayest intercept the blow, for he be over slow, and always his eyes proclaim where his blade will fall. Full well I knoweth that for often have I exercised against him." "And he hasn't killed you," Blake reminded him. "Ah, we did but practice, but on the morrow it will be different, for Malud engages thee to the death, in mortal combat, my friend, to wash away in blood the affront thou didst put upon him." "He wants to kill me just for that?" asked Blake. "I'll tell the world he's a touchy little rascal. Were it only that, he might be satisfied merely to draw blood, but there is more that he hath against thee." "More? What?" "I've scarcely spoken to him a dozen times," said Blake. "He be jealous." "Jealous? Of whom?" "He would wed the princess, and he hath seen in what manner thou lookest at her," explained Richard. "Poppycock," cried Blake, but he flushed. "Nay, he be not the only one who hath marked it," insisted Richard. "You're crazy," snapped Blake. "Often men look thus at the princess, for she be beautiful beyond compare, but—" "Has he killed them all?" demanded the American. "No, for the princess didst not look back at them in the same manner." Blake leaned back upon his bench and laughed. "Now I know you're crazy," he cried, "all of you. I'll admit that I think the princess is a mighty sweet kid, but say, young fellow, she can't see me a little bit. Enough of thy outlandish speech. I grasp to gather thy meaning, James, but thou canst not confuse me upon the one subject, nor deceive me upon the other. The eyes of the princess seldom leave thee whilst thou art at practice upon the lists, and the look in thine when they rest upon her. Hast ever seen a hound adoring his master? Run along and sell your papers," admonished Blake. "For this, Malud, wouldst put thee out of the way, and it is because I know this that I grieve, for I have learned to like thee over well, my friend." Blake arose and came around the end of the table. "You're a good old scout, Richard," he said, placing a hand affectionately upon the other's shoulder. "But do not worry. I am not dead yet. I know I seem awkward with the sword, but I have learned much about its possibilities within the past few days, and I think that Sir Malud has a surprise awaiting him. Thy courage and thy vast assurance should carry thee far, James, but they may not overcome a lifetime of practice with the sword, and that is the advantage Malud hath over thee." "Does Prince Gobred favor Malud's suit?" demanded Blake. "Why not? Malud is a powerful knight with a great castle of his own and many horses and retainers. Besides a dozen knights, he hath fully 100 men-at-arms. There are several knights who have their own castles and following, are there not?" asked Blake. 20, perchance," replied Richard. "And they live close to Gobred's castle, at the edge of the hills, within 3 leagues upon either hand of Gobred's castle," explained Richard. "And no others live in all this great valley?" demanded Blake. "You have heard mention made of Bohun?" asked Richard. "Yes, often. Why?" "He calls himself king, but never will we refer to him as king. He and his followers dwell upon the opposite side of the valley. They number, perchance, as many as we, and we be always at war against them. But I've been hearing quite a bit about a great tournament for which the knights are practicing now. I thought that Bohun and his knights were to take part in it. They be. Once each year, commencing upon the first Sunday of Lent, and extending over a period of 3 days, there hath been from time immemorial a truce declared between the fronters and the backers, during which is held the great Tourney, 1 year in the plain before the city of Nimmer, and the next year in the plain before the city of the Sepulchre, as they call it. "Fronters and backers. What in heck do those mean?" demanded Blake. "Thou art a knight of Nimir and know not that," exclaimed Richard. "What I know about knighting would rattle around in a peanut shell," admitted Blake. "Thou shouldst know, and I shall tell thee." "Hark thee well, then," said Richard, "for I must need go back to the very beginning." He poured 2 goblets of wine from a flagon standing on the floor beside him, took a long drink, and proceeded with his tale. "Richard I sailed from Sicily in the spring of 1191 with all his great following bound for Acre, where he was to meet the French king, Philip Augustus, and wrest the Holy Land from the power of the Saracen. But Richard tarried upon the way to conquer Cyprus and punish the vile despot who had placed an insult upon Berengaria, whom Richard was to wed. When the great company again set their sails for Acre, there were many Cyprian maidens hidden away upon the ships by knights who had taken a fancy to their lovely faces, and it so befell that 2 of these ships, encountering a storm, were blown from their course and wrecked upon the Afric shore. One of these companies was commanded by a knight yclept Bohun, and the other by one Gobred, and though they marched together they kept separate, other than when attacked. Thus, searching for Jerusalem, they came upon this valley which the followers of Bohun declared was the Valley of the Holy Sepulchre, and that the crusade was over. Their crosses that they had worn upon their breasts, as do all crusaders who have not reached their goal, they removed and placed upon their backs to signify that the crusade was over and that they were returning home. Gobred insisted that this was not the Valley of the Holy Sepulchre, and that the crusade was not accomplished. He, therefore, and all his followers, retained their crosses upon their breasts, and built a city and a strong castle to defend the entrance to the valley, that Bohun and his followers might be prevented from returning to England until they had accomplished their mission. Bohun crossed the valley and built a city and a castle to prevent Gobred from pushing on in the direction in which the latter knew that the true sepulchre lay, and for nearly 7.5 centuries the descendants of Bohun have prevented the descendants of Gobred from pushing on and rescuing the Holy Land from the Saracen, while the descendants of Gobred have prevented the descendants of Bohun from returning to England, to the dishonor of knighthood. Gobred took the title of Prince and Bohun that of King, and these titles have been handed down from father to son during the centuries, while the followers of Gobred still wear the cross upon their breasts, and are called therefrom the Fronters, and the followers of Bohun wear theirs upon their backs and are called backers. And you would still push on and liberate the Holy Land? Asked Blake. Yes, replied Richard, and the backers would return to England. But long since have we realized the futility of either hope, since we be surrounded by a vast army of Saracens, and our numbers be too few to pit against them. Thinkest thou not that we are wise to remain here under such stress? He demanded. Well, you'd certainly surprise him if you rode into Jerusalem or London, either, admitted Blake. On the whole, Richard, I'd remain right here, if I were you. You see, after 735 years, most of the home folks may have forgotten you, and even the Saracens might not know what it was all about if you came charging into Jerusalem. Mayhap you speak wisely, James, said Richard, and then, too, we be content here, knowing no other country. For a while, both men were silent in thought. Blake was the first to speak. This big tourney interests me, he said. You say it starts the first Sunday in Lent. That's not far away. No, not far. Why? I was wondering if you thought I'd be in shape to have a part in it. I'm getting better and better with the lance every day. Sir Richard looked sadly at him and shook his head. Tomorrow thou wilt be dead, he said. Say, you're a cheerful party, exclaimed Blake. I am only truthful, good friend, replied Richard. It grieveth my heart sorely that it should be true, but true it be thou canst not prevail over Sir Malud on the morrow. Wouldst that I might take thy place in the lists against him, but that may not be. But I console myself with the thought that thou wilt comport thyself courageously and die as a good Sir Knight should, with no stain upon thy escutcheon. Greatly will it solace the Princess Guinalda to know that thou didst die thus. You think so? Ventured Blake. Verily. And if I don't die, will she be put out? Put out? Put out of what? Demanded Richard. Will she be sore vexed then? Corrected Blake. I should not go so far as to say that, admitted Richard. But natheless it appears certain that no lady would rejoice to see her promised husband overthrown and killed. And if thou art not slain, it may only be because thou hast slain Malud. She is his affianced wife, demanded Blake. 'Tis understood, that be all. As yet no formal marriage banns have been proclaimed. I'm going to turn in, snapped Blake. If I've got to be killed tomorrow, I ought to get a little sleep tonight. As he stretched himself upon a rough wool blanket that was spread over a bed of rushes upon the stone floor in one corner of the room, and drew another similar blanket over him, he felt less like sleep than he had ever felt before. The knowledge that on the morrow he was to meet a medieval knight in mortal combat naturally gave him considerable concern, but Blake was too self-reliant and too young to seriously harbor the belief that he would be the one to be killed. He knew it was possible, but he did not intend to permit the thought to upset him. There was, however, another that did. It upset him very much, and too it made him angry when he realized that he was concerned about it, about the proposed marriage of Sir Malud of West Castle and Guinalda, Princess of Nimr. Could it be that he had been ass enough, he soliloquized, to have fallen in love with this little medieval princess, who probably looked upon him as dirt beneath her feet? And what was he going to do about Malud? Suppose he should get the better of the fellow on the morrow? Well, what about it? If he killed him, that would make Guinalda unhappy. If he didn't kill him, what? Sir James did not know. Chapter 13. In the Beyt of Zeyd, Ibn Yad waited 3 days in his menzil, but no gala guides arrived to lead him into the valley as Batando had promised, and so he sent Fejwan once more to the chief to urge him to hasten. For always in the mind of Ibn Yad was the fear of Tarzan of the apes, and the thought that he might return to thwart and punish him. He knew he was out of Tarzan's country now, but he also knew that where boundaries were so vague, he could not definitely count upon this fact as an assurance of safety from reprisal. His one hope was that Tarzan was awaiting his return through Tarzan's country, and this Ibn Jad had definitely decided not to attempt. Instead, he was planning upon moving directly west, passing north of the ape-man's stamping grounds, until he picked up the trail to the north, down which he had traveled from the desert country. In the muqad of the sheikh with Ibn Jad sat Tolok, his brother, and Fahd and Stimbul, besides some other Arab. They were speaking of Batando's delay in sending guides, and they were fearful of treachery, for it had long been apparent to them that the old chief was gathering a great army of warriors, and though Fejwan assured them that they would not be used against the Arab if Ibn Jad resorted to no treachery, yet they were all apprehensive of danger. Ataja, employed with the duties of the harem, did not sing nor smile as had been her wont, for her heart was heavy with mourning for her lover. She heard the talk in the muqad, but it did not interest her. Seldom did her eyes glance above the curtain that separated the women's quarters from the muqad, and when they did, the fires of hatred blazed within them as they crossed the countenance of Fahd. She chanced to be thus glancing when she saw Fahd's eyes, which were directed outward across the menzil, go suddenly wide with astonishment. "Billah, Ibn Jad," cried the man. "Look!" With the others, Ataja glanced in the direction Fahd was staring, and with the other she voiced a little gasp of astonishment, though those of the men were rounded into oaths. Walking straight across the menzil toward the sheik's Beyt, strode a bronzed giant armed with a spear, arrows, and a knife. Upon his back was suspended an oval shield, and across one shoulder and his breast was coiled a rope, hand-plaited from long fibers. "Tarzan of the apes," ejaculated Ibn Jad. "The curse of Allah be upon him." "He must have brought his black warriors with him and left them hidden in the forest," whispered Tolok. "Not else would he dare enter the menzil of the Bedou." Ibn Jad was heartsick, and he was thinking fast when the ape-man halted directly in the outer opening of the muqad. Tarzan let his eyes run quickly over the assemblage. They stopped upon Stimbul, finally. "Where is Blake?" he demanded of the American. "You ought to know," growled Stimbul. "Have you seen him since you and he separated?" "No." "You are sure of that?" insisted the ape-man. "Of course I am." Tarzan turned to Ibn Jad. "You have lied to me. You are not here to trade, but to find and sack a city, to take its treasure and steal its women." "That is a lie," cried Ibn Jad. "Whoever told thee that lied." "I do not think he lied," replied Tarzan. "He seemed an honest youth." "Who was he?" demanded Ibn Jad. "His name is Zeyd." Ataja heard and was suddenly galvanized to new interest. "He says all this and more, and I believe him." "What else did he tell thee, Nasrani?" "That another stole his musket and sought to slay thee, Ibn Jad, and then put the blame upon him." "That is a lie, like all he hath told thee," cried Fahd. Ibn Jad sat in thought, his brows contracted in a dark scowl, but presently he looked up at Tarzan with a crooked smile. "Doubtless the poor youth thought that he spoke the truth," he said, "just as he thought that he should slay his sheikh, and for the same reason. Always hath his brain been sick, but never before did I think him dangerous. He hath deceived thee, Tarzan of the apes, and that I can prove by all my people, as well as by this Nasrani I have befriended. For all will tell thee that I am seeking to obey thee and leave thy country. Why else, then, should I have traveled north back in the directions of my own Beled? If thou wish to obey me, why didst thou hold me prisoner and send thy brother to slay me in the night?" asked Tarzan. Again thou wrongst Ibn Jad, said the sheikh sadly. My brother came to cut thy bonds and set thee free, but thou set upon him, and then came El-Fil and carried thee away. And what meant thy brother when he raised his knife and cried, Die, Nasrani, demanded the ape-man. Saith a man thus who cometh to do a kindness? I did but joke, mumbled Tolok. I am here again, said Tarzan, but not to joke. My waziri are coming. Together we shall see you well on your way toward the desert. It is what we wish, said the sheikh quickly. Ask this other Nasrani if it be not true that we are lost, and would be but too glad to have thee lead us upon the right way. Here we be beset by Gala warriors. Their chief hath been gathering them for days, and momentarily we fear that we shall be attacked. Is that not true, Nasrani? He turned to Stimble as he spoke. Yes, it is true, said Stimble. It is true that you are going to leave the country, said Tarzan, and I shall remain to see that you do so. Tomorrow you will start. In the meantime, set aside a beat for me, and let there be no more treachery. Thou needst fear nothing, Ibn Jad assured him. Then he turned his face toward the women's quarters. Hirfa, Ateja, he called. Make ready the Beyt of Zeyd for the sheikh of the jungle. To one side, but at no great distance from the Beyt of Ibn Jad, the two women raised the black tent for Tarzan, and when the Amdan had been placed and straightened, and the Tunbel Beyt made fast to the pegs that Ateja drove into the earth, Hirfa returned to her household duties, leaving her daughter to stretch the side curtains. The instant that Hirfa was out of earshot, Ateja ran to Tarzan. "O Nasrani," she cried, "thou hast seen my Zeyd? He is safe?" "I left him in a village where the chief will care for him until such time as thy people come upon thy return to the desert country. He is quite safe and well." "Tell me of him, O Nasrani, for my heart hungers for word of him," implored the girl. "How came you upon him? Where was he?" "His mare had been dragged down by Eladrea, who was about to devour your lover. I chanced to be there and slew Eladrea. Then I took Zeyd to the village of a chief who is my friend, for I knew that he could not survive the perils of the jungle should I leave him afoot and alone. It was my thought to send him from the country in safety, but he begged to remain until you returned that way. This I have permitted. In a few weeks you will see your lover." Tears were falling from Ateja's long black lashes, tears of joy, as she seized Tarzan's hand and kissed it. "My life is thine, Nasrani," she cried, "for that thou hast given me back my lover." That night, as the gala slave, Feijuan, walked through the menzil of his masters, he saw Ibn Jad and Tolok sitting in the sheikh's mukad, whispering together, and Feijuan, well aware of the inherent turpitude of this precious pair, wondered what might be the nature of their plotting. Behind the curtain of the harem, Ateja lay huddled upon her sleeping mat, but she did not sleep. Instead, she was listening to the whispered conversation of her father and her uncle. "He must be put out of the way," Ibn Jad insisted. "But his waziri are coming," objected Tolog. "If they do not find him here, what can we say? They will not believe us, whatever we say. They will set upon us. I have heard that they are terrible men." "Bayullah," cried Ibn Jad. "If he stays, we are undone. Better risk something than to return empty-handed to our own country after all that we have passed through." "If thou thinkest that I shall again take this business upon myself, thou art mistaken, brother," said Tolog. "Once was enough. No, not thee, but we must find a way. Is there none among us who might wish more than another to be rid of the Nasrani?" asked Ibn Jad, but to himself as though he were thinking aloud. "The other Nasrani," exclaimed Tolog. "He hateth him." Ibn Jad clapped his hands together. Thou hast it, brother. But still shall we be held responsible, reminded Tolok. What matter if he be out of the way? We can be no worse off than we now are. Suppose Batando came tomorrow with the guides. Then indeed would the jungle sheik know that we have lied to him, and it might go hard with us. No, we must be rid of him this very night. Yes, but how? Asked Tolog. Hold, I have a plan. Listen well, O brother. And Ibn Yard rubbed his palms together and smiled. But he would not have smiled, perhaps had he known that Ataja listened, or had he seen the silent figure crouching in the dark, just beyond the outer curtain of his Beyt. Speak, Ibn Yard, urged Tolog. Tell me thy plan. Wella, it is known by all that the Nasrani Stimbol hates the Sheikh of the jungle. With loud tongue he hath proclaimed it many times before all when many were gathered in my Mukad. You would send Stimbol to slay Tarzan of the apes. Thou guessed aright, admitted Ibn Jad. But how wilt that relieve us of responsibility? He wilt have been slain by thy order in thine own menzil, objected Tolog. Wait, I shall not command the one Nasrani to slay the other. I shall but suggest it, and when it is done I shall be filled with rage and horror that this murder hath been done in my menzil. And to prove my good faith I shall order that the murderer be put to death in punishment for his crime. Thus we shall be rid of two unbelieving dogs, and at the same time be able to convince the Waziri that we were indeed the friends of their sheikh, for we shall mourn him with loud lamentations, when the Waziri shall have arrived. Allah be praised for such a brother, exclaimed Tolok, enraptured. Go thou now at once, and summon the Nasrani Stimbol, directed Ibn Yad. Send him to me alone, and after I have spoken with him, and he hath departed upon his errand, come thee back to my Beyt. Ataja trembled upon her sleeping mat, while the silent figure crouching outside the sheikh's tent arose after Tolog had departed and disappeared in the darkness of the night. Hastily summoned from the Beyt of Fard, Stimbul, cautioned to stealth by Tolog, moved silently through the darkness to the Mukad of the sheikh, where he found Ibn Yad awaiting him. Sit, Nasrani, invited the Bedouin. What in hell do you want of me this time of night? Demanded Stimbul. I have been talking with Tarzan of the apes, said Ibn Jad, and because you are my friend and he is not, I have sent for you to tell you what he plans for you. He has interfered in all my designs and is driving me from the country, but that is as nothing compared with what he intends for you. What in hell is he up to now? Demanded Stimbul. He's always butting into someone else's business. Thou dost not like him? Asked Ibn Jad. Why should I? And Stimbul applied a vile epithet to Tarzan. Thou wilt like him less when I tell thee, said Ibn Jad. Well, tell me. He says that thou hast slain thy companion, Blake, explained the sheikh, and for that Tarzan is going to kill thee on the morrow. Eh? What? Kill me? Demanded Stimbul. Why, he can't do it. What does he think he is? A Roman emperor? Nevertheless, he will do as he says, insisted Ibn Yad. He is all-powerful here. No one questions the acts of this great jungle sheikh. Tomorrow he will kill thee. But you won't let him, Ibn Jad. Surely you won't let him. Stimbul was already trembling with terror. Ibn Jad elevated his palms. What can I do? He asked. You can. Why, there must be something that you can do, wailed the frightened man. There is naught that any can do, save yourself, whispered the sheikh. What do you mean? He lies asleep in yon Beyt, and thou hast a sharp kusa. I have never killed a man, whimpered Stimbul. Nor hast thou ever been killed, reminded the sheikh. But tonight thou must kill, or tomorrow thou wilt be killed. God, gasped Stimble. "It is late," said Ibn Yad, "and I go to my sleeping mat. I have warned thee, do what thou wilt in the matter." And he arose as though to enter the woman's quarters. Trembling, Stimble staggered out into the night. For a moment he hesitated, then he crouched and crept silently through the darkness toward the Beyt that had been erected for the ape-man. But ahead of him ran Ateya to warn the man who had saved her lover from the fangs of Eladrea. She was almost at the Beyt she had helped to erect for the ape-man when a figure stepped from another tent and, clapping a palm across her mouth and an arm about her waist, held her firmly. "Where goest thou?" whispered a voice in her ear, a voice that she recognized at once as belonging to her uncle. But Tolog did not wait for a reply. He answered for her. "Thou goest to warn the Nasrani because he befriended thy lover. Get thee back to thy father's, Beyt. If he knew this, he would slay thee. Go." And he gave her a great shove in the direction from which she had come. There was a nasty smile upon Tolog's lips as he thought how neatly he had foiled the girl, and he thanked Allah that chance had placed him in a position to intercept her before she had been able to ruin them all. And even as Tolog, the brother of the sheik, smiled in his beard, a hand reached out of the darkness behind him and seized him by the throat. Fingers grasped him and dragged him away. Trembling, bathed in cold sweat, grasping in tightly clenched fingers the hilt of a keen knife, Wilbur Stimble crept through the darkness toward the tent of his victim. Stimble had been an irritable man, a bully and a coward. But he was no criminal. Every fiber of his being revolted at the thing he contemplated. He did not want to kill, but he was a cornered human rat, and he thought that death stared him in the face, leaving open only this one way of escape. As he entered the beat of the ape-man, he steeled himself to accomplish that for which he had come, and he was indeed a very dangerous, a very formidable man. As he crept to the side of the figure lying in the darkness, wrapped in an old burnous. Chapter 14. Sword and Buckler. As the sun touched the turrets of the castle of the Prince of Nimmer, a youth rolled from between his blankets, rubbed his eyes, and stretched. Then he reached over and shook another youth of about his own age, who slept beside him. "Awaken, Edward! Awaken, thou sluggard!" he cried. Edward rolled over on his back and essayed to say, "Eh?" and to yawn at the same time. "Up, lad," urged Michael. "Forgottest thou that thy master fares forth to be slain this day?" Edward sat up, now fully awake. His eyes flashed. "'Tis a lie," he cried loyally. "He will cleave Sir Mallard from pole to breastplate with a single blow. Livest no Sir Knight with such mighty thews as hast Sir James. Thou art disloyal, Michael, to Sir Richard's friend, who hath been a good and kindly friend to us as well." Michael patted the other lad upon the shoulder. "Nay, I did but jest, Edward," he said. "My hopes be all for Sir James, and yet—" He paused. "I fear." "Fear what?" demanded Edward. "That Sir James be not well enough versed in the use of sword and buckler to overcome Sir Mallard. For even were his strength the strength of 10 men, it shall avail him naught without the skill to use it." "Thou shalt see," maintained Edward stoutly. "I see that Sir James hath a loyal squire," said a voice behind them, and turning they saw Sir Richard standing in the doorway. "And may all his friends wish him well this day, thus loyally. I fell asleep last night praying to our Lord Jesus to guide his blade through Sir Mallard's helm," said Edward. "Good. Get thee up now, and look to thy master's mail and to the trappings of his steed, that he may enter the lists bedight as befits a noble Sir Knight of Nimmer," instructed Richard, and left them. It was 11 o'clock of this February morning. The sun shone down into the great north ballium of the castle of Nîmes, glinting from the polished mail of noble knights and from pike and battle-axe of men-at-arms, picking out the gay colors of the robes of the women gathered in the grandstand below the inner wall. Upon a raised dais at the front and center of the grandstand sat Prince Gobred and his party, and upon either side of them, and extending to the far ends of the stand, were ranged the noble knights and ladies of Nîmes, while behind them sat men-at-arms who were off duty, then the freedmen, and, last of all, the serfs, for under the beneficent rule of the house of Gobred, these were accorded many privileges. At either end of the lists was a tent, gay with pennons and the colors and devices of its owner, one with the green and gold of Sir Malud, and the other with the blue and silver of Sir James. Before each of these tilts stood 2 men-at-arms, resplendent in new apparel, the metal of their battle-axes gleaming brightly, and here a groom held a restive, richly caparisoned charger, while the squire of each of the contestants busied himself with last-minute preparations for the encounter. A trumpeter, statuesque, the bell of his trumpet resting upon his hip, waited for the signal to sound the fanfare that would announce the entrance of his master into the lists. A few yards to the rear, a second charger champed upon his bit as he nuzzled the groom that held him in waiting for the knight who would accompany each of the contestants upon the field. In the blue and silver tilt sat Blake and Sir Richard, the latter issuing instructions and advice, and of the two he was the more nervous. Blake's hauberk, gorget, and bassinet were of heavy chainmail, the latter lined inside and covered outside, down to the gorget, with leopard skin, offering fair protection for his head from an ordinary glancing blow. Upon his breast was sewn a large red cross, and from one shoulder depended the streamers of a blue and silver rosette. Hanging from the pole of the tilt, upon a wooden peg, were Blake's sword and buckler. The grandstand was filled. Prince Gobred glanced up at the sun and spoke to a knight at his side. The latter gave a brief command to a trumpeter stationed at the princely loge, and presently, loud and clear, the notes of a trumpet rang in the ballium. Instantly the tilts at either end of the lists were galvanized to activity, while the grandstand seemed to spring to new life as necks were craned first toward the tent of Sir Malud, and then toward that of Sir James. Edward, flushed with excitement, ran into the tilt, and seizing Blake's sword, passed the girdle about his hips and buckled it in place at his left side. Then, with the buckler, he followed his master out of the tilt. Dazed, as Blake prepared to mount, Edward held his stirrup, while the groom sought to quiet the nervous horse. The lad pressed Blake's leg after he had swung into the saddle, no light accomplishment, weighed down as he was by heavy chainmail, and looked up into his face. "I have prayed for thee, Sir James," he said. "I know that thou wilt prevail." Blake saw tears in the youth's eyes as he looked down at him, and he caught a choking note in his voice. "You're a good boy, Eddie," he said. "I'll promise that you won't have to be ashamed of me." "Ah, Sir James, how could I? Even in death thou wilt be a noble figure of a knight. And fairer one it hath never been given one to see, methinks," Edward assured him as he handed him his round buckler. Sir Richard had by now mounted, and at a signal from him that they were ready, there was a fanfare from the trumpet at Sir Malud's tilt, and that noble Sir Knight rode forward, followed by a single knight. Blake's trumpeter now announced his master's entry, and the American rode out close along the front of the grandstand, followed by Sir Richard. There was a murmur of applause for each contestant, which increased as they advanced and met before Prince Gobred's loge. Here the 4 knights reined in and faced the prince, and each raised the hilt of his sword to his lips and kissed it in salute. as Gobrid cautioned them to fight honorably as true knights and reminded them of the rules governing the encounter. Blake's eyes wandered to the face of Gwynalda. The little princess sat stiffly erect, looking straight before her. She seemed very white, Blake thought, and he wondered if she were ill. How beautiful, thought Blake, and though she did not once appear to look at him, he was not cast down, for neither did she look at Malud. Again the trumpet sounded, and the 4 knights rode slowly back to opposite ends of the lists, and the principals waited for the final signal to engage. Blake disengaged his arm from the leather loop of his buckler and tossed the shield upon the ground. Edward looked at him aghast. "My lord knight," he cried, "art ill? Art fainting? Didst drop thy buckler?" And he snatched it up and held it aloft to Blake, though he knew full well that his eyes had not deceived him, and that his master had cast aside his only protection. To the horrified Edward there seemed but one explanation, and that his loyalty would not permit him to entertain for an instant that Blake was preparing to dismount and refuse to meet Sir Malud, giving the latter the victory by default, and assuring himself of the contempt and ridicule of all Nimmer. He ran to Richard, who had not seen Blake's act. Sir Richard, he cried in a hoarse whisper, "some terrible affliction hath befallen Sir James." "Hey, what?" exclaimed Richard. "What meaneth thou, lad?" "He has cast aside his buckler," cried the youth. "He must be stricken sore ill, for it cannot be that otherwise he would refuse combat." Richard spurred to Blake's side. "Hast gone mad, man?" he demanded. "Thou canst not refuse the encounter now, unless thou wouldst bring dishonor upon thy friends." "Where did you get that line?" demanded Blake. "Who said I was going to quit? Oh, but thy buckler," cried Sir Richard. The trumpet at the prince's loge rang out peremptorily. Sir Malud spurred forward to a fanfare from his own trumpeter. "Let her go," cried Blake to his. "Thy buckler," screamed Sir Richard. "The damned thing was in my way," shouted Blake, as he spurred forward to meet the doughty Malud, Richard trailing behind him, as did Malud's second behind that knight. There was a confident smile upon the lips of Sir Malud, and he glanced often at the knights and ladies in the grandstand, but Blake rode with his eyes always upon his antagonist. Both horses had broken immediately into a gallop, and as they neared one another, Malud spurred forward at a run, and Blake saw that the man's aim was doubtless to overthrow him at the first impact, or at least to so throw him out of balance as to make it easy for Malud to strike a good blow before he could recover himself. Malud rode with his sword half raised at his right side, while Blake's was at guard, a position unknown to the knights of Nimmer, who guarded solely with their bucklers. The horsemen approached to engage upon each other's left, and as they were about to meet, Sir Malud rose in his stirrups and swung his sword hand down to gain momentum, described a circle with his blade, and launched a terrific cut at Blake's head. It was at that instant that some few in the grandstand realized that Blake bore no buckler. His buckler? Sir James hath no buckler. He hath lost his buckler, rose now from all parts of the stand, and from right beside him, where the 2 knights met before the loge of Gobrid, Blake heard a woman scream, but he could not look to see if it were Gwynalda. As they met, Blake reined his horse suddenly toward Malud's, so that the 2 chargers' shoulders struck, and at the same time he cast all his weight in the same direction, whereas Malud, who was standing in his stirrups to deliver his blow, was almost in a state of equilibrium, and having his buckler ready for defense, was quite helpless, in so far as maneuvering his mount was concerned. Malud, overbalanced, lost the force, and changed the direction of his blow, which fell, much to the knight's surprise, upon Blake's blade, along which it spent its force and was deflected from its target. Instantly his horse well in hand by reason that his left arm was unencumbered by a buckler, Blake reined in and simultaneously cut to the left and rear. his point opening the mail on Malud's left shoulder and biting into the flesh before the latter's horse had carried him out of reach. A loud shout of approbation arose from the stands, for the thing had been neatly done, and then Malud's second spurred to the prince's loge and entered a protest. "Sir James hath no buckler," he cried. "'Tis no fair combat." "'Tis fairer for thy knight than for Sir James," said Gobred. "We would not take that advantage of him," parried Malud's second, Sir Jared. "What sayest thou?" demanded Gobred of Sir Richard, who had quickly ridden to Jared's side. "Is Sir James without a buckler through some accident that befell before he entered the lists?" "Nay, he cast it aside," replied Richard, "and averred that the damned thing did annoy him. But if Sir Jared feeleth that, because of this, they be not fairly matched, we are willing that Sir Malud also should cast aside his buckler." Gobred smiled. "That be fair," he said. The two men, concerned with their encounter, and not with the argument of their seconds, had engaged once more. Blood was showing upon Malud's shoulder and trickling down his back, staining his skirts and the housing of his charger. The stand was in an uproar, for many were still shouting aloud about the buckler, and others were screaming with delight over the neat manner in which Sir James had drawn his first blood. Wagers were being freely made, and though Sir Malud still ruled favourite in the betting, the odds against Blake were not so great, and while men had no money to wager, they had jewels and arms and horses. One enthusiastic adherent of Sir Malud bet 3 chargers against one that his champion would be victorious, and the words were scarce out of his mouth ere he had a dozen takers, whereas before the opening passage at arms offers as high as 10-1 had found no takers. Now the smile was gone from Malud's lips, and he glanced no more at the grandstand. There was rage in his eyes as he spurred again toward Blake, who he thought had profited by a lucky accident. Unhampered by a buckler, Blake took full advantage of the nimbleness of the wiry horse he rode, and which he had ridden daily since his arrival in Nimmer, so that man and beast were well accustomed to one another. Again Sir Malud saw his blade glance harmlessly from the sword of his antagonist, and then, to his vast surprise, the point of Sir James's blade leaped quickly beneath his buckler and entered his side. It was not a deep wound, but it was painful, and again it brought blood. Angrily Malud struck again, but Blake had reined his charger quickly to the rear, and before Malud could gather his reins, Blake had struck him again, this time a heavy blow upon the helm. Half stunned and wholly infuriated, Malud wheeled and charged at full tilt, once again determined to ride his adversary down. They met with a crash directly in front of Gobred's loge. There was a quick play of swords that baffled the eyesight of the onlookers, and then, to the astonishment of all, most particularly Malud, that noble Sir Knight's sword flew from his grasp and hurtled to the field, leaving him entirely to the mercy of his foe. Malud reined in and sat erect, waiting. He knew, and Blake knew, that under the rules that governed their encounter, Blake was warranted in running him through, unless Malud sued for mercy, and no one, Blake least of all, expected this of so proud and haughty a knight. Sir Malud sat proudly on his charger, waiting for Blake to advance and kill him. Utter silence had fallen upon the stands, so that the champing of Malud's horse upon its bit was plainly audible. Blake turned to Sir Jared. "Summon a squire, Sir Knight," he said, "to return Sir Malud's sword to him." Again the stands rocked to the applause, but Blake turned his back upon them and rode to Richard's side to wait until his adversary was again armed. "Well, old top," he inquired of Sir Richard, "just how much a dozen am I offered for bucklers now?" Richard laughed. "Thou hast been passing fortunate, James," he replied, "but methinks a good swordsman would long since have cut thee through." I know Malud would have if I had packed that chopping bowl along on the party, Blake assured him, though it is doubtful if Sir Richard understood what he was talking about, as was so often the case when Blake discoursed that Richard had long since ceased to even speculate as to the meaning of much that his friend said. But now Sir Malud was rearmed and riding towards Blake. He stopped his horse before the American and bowed low. "I do my devoirs to a noble and generous knight," he said graciously. Blake bowed. "Are you ready, sir?" he asked. Malud nodded. "On guard, then," snapped the American. For a moment the two jockeyed for position. Blake feinted and Malud raised his buckler before his face to catch the blow, but, as it did not fall, he lowered his shield, just as Blake had known that he would, and as he did so the edge of the American's weapon fell heavily upon the crown of his bassinet. Malud's arm dropped at his side. He slumped in his saddle and then toppled forward and rolled to the ground. Agile even in his heavy armor, Blake dismounted and walked to where his foe lay, stretched upon his back, almost in front of Gobred's loge. He placed a foot upon Malud's breast and pressed the point of his sword against his throat. The crowd leaned forward to see the coup de grace administered, but Blake did not drive his point home. He looked up at Prince Gobred and addressed him. "Here is a brave knight," he said, "with whom I have no real quarrel. I spare him to your service, Prince, and to those who love him." And his eyes went straight to the eyes of the Princess Guinalda. Then he turned and walked back along the front of the grandstand to his own tilt, while Richard rode behind him, and the knights and the ladies, the men-at-arms, the freedmen and the serfs stood upon their seats and shouted their applause. Edouard was beside himself with joy, as was Michel. The former knelt and embraced Blake's legs. He kissed his hand and wept, so great were his happiness and his excitement. "I knew it! I knew it!" he cried. "Didst I not tell thee, Michel, that my own Sir Knight would overthrow Sir Malud?" The men-at-arms, the trumpeter, and the grooms at Blake's tilt wore grins that stretched from ear to ear. Whereas a few minutes before they had felt ashamed to have been detailed to the losing side, now they were most proud, and looked upon Blake as the greatest hero of Nimmer Great would be their boasting among their fellows, as they gathered with their flagons of ale about the rough deal table in their dining hall. Edouard removed Blake's armor, and Michel got Richard out of his amidst much babbling upon the part of the youths who could not contain themselves, so doubly great was their joy because so unexpected. Blake went directly to his quarters, and Richard accompanied him, and when the two men were alone, Richard placed a hand upon Blake's shoulder. "Thou hast done a noble and chivalrous thing, my friend," he said, "but I know not that it be a wise one." "And why?" demanded Blake. "You didn't think I could stick the poor mutt when he was lying there defenseless?" Richard shook his head. "'Tis but what he would have done for thee had thy positions been reversed," said he. "Well, I couldn't do it. We're not taught to believe that it is exactly ethical to hit a fellow when he's down, where I come from," explained Blake. "Had your quarrel been no deeper than appeared upon the surface, thou might well have been thus magnanimous. But Malud be jealous of thee, and that jealousy will be by no means lessened by what hath transpired this day. Thou might have been rid of a powerful and dangerous enemy, had thou given him the coup de grace, as was thy right. But now thou hast raised up a greater enemy, since to his jealousy is added hatred and envy against thee, for thy prowess over him. Thou didst make him appear like a monkey, James, and that Sir Malud wilt never forgive, and I know the man." The knights and ladies attached to the castle of Gobred ate together at a great table in the huge hall of the castle. 300 people could be accommodated at the single board, and it took quite a company of serving men to fill their needs. Whole pigs roasted were carried in upon great trenchers, and there were legs of mutton and sides of venison and bowls of vegetables, with wine and ale, and at the end immense puddings. There was much laughter and loud talking, and it all presented a wild and fascinating picture to Sir James Blake as he sat at the lower end of the table far below the salt that night, in his accustomed place as one of the latest neophytes in the noble ranks of the knighthood of Nimmer. The encounter between himself and Mallard was the subject of the moment, and many were the compliments bestowed upon him, and many the questions as to where and how he had acquired his strange technique of swordsmanship. Although they had seen him accomplish it, yet they still appeared to believe it inconceivable that a man might prevail without a buckler over one who carried this essential article of defense. Prince Gobred and his family sat with the higher nobles of Nimmer at a table slightly raised above the rest of the board and running across its upper end, the whole forming a huge T. When he wished to speak to anyone farther down the table, he resorted to the simple expedient of raising his voice, so that if several were so inclined at the same time, the room became a bedlam for uproar and confusion. And as Blake sat at the farthest end of the table, it was necessary for one at Gobred's end to scream to attract attention. Though when it was discovered that it was the prince who was speaking, the rest of the company usually lapsed into silence, out of respect for him, unless they were too far gone in drink. Shortly after the feasters were seated, Gobred had arisen and lifted his goblet high in air, and silence had fallen upon the whole company as knights and ladies rose and faced their prince. "Hail to our king!" cried Gobred. "Hail to our liege lord Richard of England!" And in a great chorus rose the answering "Hail!" as the company drank the health of Richard Coeur de Lion, 728 years after his death. Then they drank the health of Gobred, and of the Princess Brunilda, his wife, and of the Princess Guinalda, and each time a voice boomed from just below the dais of the prince, "Here I be looking at thee," as Sir Richard with a proud smile displayed his newly acquired knowledge. Again Prince Gobred arose. "Hail," he cried, "to that worthy Sir Knight who hath most nobly and chivalrously acquitted himself in the lists this day. Hail to Sir James, Knight Templar, and now Knight of Nimmer." Not even the name of Richard the Foot of England had aroused the enthusiasm that followed the drinking to Sir James. The length of the long hall, Blake's eyes traveled straight to where Guinalda stood. He saw her drink to him, and he saw that her eyes were regarding him, but the distance was too great, and the light of the pitch torches and the oil cressets too dim for him to see whether her glance carried a message of friendship or dislike. When the noise had partially subsided and the drinkers had retaken their seats, Blake arose. "Prince Gobred," he called the length of the room, "knights and ladies of Nimmer, I give you another toast. To Sir Mallard." For a moment there was silence, the silence of surprise, and then the company arose and drank the health of the absent Sir Mallard. "Thou art a strange Sir Knight, with strange words upon thy lips and strange ways, Sir James," shouted Gobred. "But though thou callest a hal a toast, and thy friends be old Top and Kid, yet withal it seemeth that we understand thee, and we would know more about thy country and the ways of the noble knights that do abide there. Tell us, are they all thus chivalrous and magnanimous to their fallen foes?" "If they're not, they get the raspberry," explained Blake. "Get the raspberry," repeated Gobred. "'Tis some form of punishment, methinks." "You said it, Prince." "Of a surety I said it, Sir James," snapped Gobred with asperity. "I mean, Prince, that you hit the nail on the head. You guessed it the first time. You see, the raspberry is about the only form of punishment that the Knights of the Squared Circle or the Knights of the Diamond can understand. Knights of the Squared Circle, Knights of the Diamond, Those be knightly orders of which I wot not. Be they doughty knights? Some of them are doughty, but a lot of them are regulars. Take Sir Dempsey, for instance, a knight of the squared circle. He showed 'em all he was a regular knight in defeat, which is much more difficult than being a regular knight in victory. Be there other orders of knighthood these days? Demanded Galbraith. We're lousy with them. What? Cried Gobred. We're all knights these days, explained Blake. All knights, be there no serfs nor yeomen. 'Tis incredible. Well, there are some yeomen in the navy, I think, but all the rest of us, pretty much, are knights. You see, things have changed a lot since the days of Richard. The people have sort of overthrown the old order of things. They poked a lot of ridicule at knights and wanted to get rid of knighthood, and as soon as they had, they all wanted to be knights themselves. So we have Knights Templar now, and Knights of Pythias, and Knights of Columbus, and Knights of Labor, and a lot more I can't recall. Methinks it must be a fine and noble world, cried Gobred. For what with so many noble sir knights, it would seemeth that they must often contend, one against another. Is that not true? Well, they do scrap some, Blake admitted. Chapter 15. The Lonely Grave. Within the dark interior of the Beyt Stimbol could see nothing. Just before him he heard a man breathing heavily, as might one in a troubled sleep. The would-be murderer paused to steady his nerves. Then, on hands and knees, he crept forward inch by inch. Presently, one of his hands touched the prostrate figure of the sleeper. Lightly, cautiously, Stimbol groped until he had definitely discovered the position in which his victim lay. In one hand, ready, he grasped the keen knife. He scarce dared breathe for fear he might awaken the ape-man. He prayed that Tarzan was a sound sleeper, and he prayed that the first blow of his weapon would reach that savage heart. Now he was ready. He had located the exact spot where he must strike. He raised his knife and struck. His victim shuddered spasmodically. Again and again, with savage maniacal force and speed, the knife was plunged into the soft flesh. Stimbol felt the warm blood spurt out upon his hand and wrist. At length, satisfied that his mission had been accomplished, he scurried from the Beyt. Now he was trembling so that he could scarcely stand, terrified, revolted by the horrid crime he had committed. Wild-eyed, haggard, he stumbled to the Muqad of Ibn Yad's Beyt, and there he collapsed. The sheikh stepped from the women's quarters and looked down upon the trembling figure that the dim light of a paper lantern revealed. "What doest thou here, Nasrani?" he demanded. "I have done it, Ibn Yad," muttered Stimbol. "Done what?" cried the sheikh. "Slain Tarzan of the apes." "Aye, aye," screamed Ibn Yad. "Tolok, where art thou? Herfa, Ataja, come, didst hear what the Nasrani saith?" Herfa and Ataja rushed into the Muqad. "Didst hear him?" repeated Ibn Yad. "He hath slain my good friend, the great sheikh of the jungle. Motlog, fought, haste." His voice had been rising until now he was screaming at the top of his lungs, and Arab were streaming toward his beat from all directions. Stimbol, stunned by what he had done, dumb from surprise and terror at the unexpected attitude of Ibn Yad, crouched speechless in the center of the Muqad. "Seize him!" cried the sheikh to the first man that arrived. "He hath slain Tarzan of the apes, our great friend, who was to preserve us and lead us from this land of dangers. Now all wilt be our enemies. The friends of Tarzan wilt fall upon us and slay us. Allah bear witness that I be free from guilt in this matter, and let thy wrath and the wrath of the friends of Tarzan fall upon this guilty man." By this time, the entire population of the Menzil was gathered in front of the sheikh's Beyt, and if they were surprised by his protestations of sudden affection for Tarzan, they gave no evidence of it. "Take him away," commanded Ibn Yad. "In the morning we shall gather and decide what we must do." They dragged the terrified Stimble to Fard's Beyt, where they bound him hand and foot and left him for Fard to guard. When they had gone, the Bedouin leaned low over Stimble and whispered in his ear. "Didst really slay the jungle sheikh?" he demanded. "Ibn Yad forced me to do so, and now he turns against me," whimpered Stimble. "And tomorrow he will have you killed, so that he may tell the friends of Tarzan that he hath punished the slayer of Tarzan," said Fard. "Save me, Fard," begged Stimble. "Save me, and I will give you 20 million francs. I swear it. Once I am safe in the nearest European colony, I will get the money for you. Think of it, Fard, 20 million francs." "I am thinking of it, Nasrani," replied the Bedouin, "and I think that thou liest. There be not that much money in the world. I swear that I have 10 times that amount. If I have lied to you, you may kill me. Save me, save me." 20 million francs, murmured Fard. "Perchance he does not lie. Listen, Nasrani, I do not know that I can save thee, but I shall try. And if I succeed and thou forgettest the 20 million francs, I shall kill thee if I have to follow thee across the world. Dost understand?" Ibn Yad called 2 ignorant slaves to him and commanded them to go to the Beyt that had been Zeyd's and carry Tarzan's body to the edge of the menzil, where they were to dig a grave and bury it. With paper lanterns they went to the Beyt of Death, and wrapping the dead man in the old burnous that already covered him, they carried him across the menzil and laid him down while they dug a shallow grave. And so, beneath a forest giant in the land that he loved, the grave of Tarzan of the Apes was made. Roughly, the slaves rolled the corpse into the hole they had made, shoveled the dirt upon it, and left it in its lonely, unmarked tomb. Early the next morning, Ibn Yad called about him the elders of the tribe, and when they were gathered, it was noted that Tolog was missing, and though a search was made, he could not be found. Fard suggested that he had gone forth early to hunt. Ibn Yad explained to them that if they were to escape the wrath of the friends of Tarzan, they must take immediate steps to disprove their responsibility for the slaying of the ape-man, and that they might only do this and express their good faith by punishing the murderer. It was not difficult to persuade them to take the life of a Christian, and there was only one that demurred. This was Fard. "There are 2 reasons, Ibn Yad, why we should not take the life of this Nasrani," he said. "By Allah, there never be any reason why a true believer should not take the life of a Nasrani," cried one of the old men. "Listen," admonished Fard, "to what I have in mind, and then I am sure that you will agree that I am right." "Speak, Fard," said Ibn Yad. "This Nasrani is a rich and powerful man in his own balad. If it be possible to spare his life, he will command a great ransom. Dead, he is worth nothing to us. If by chance the friends of Tarzan do not learn of his death, before we are safely out of this accursed land, it will have profited us naught to have killed Stimble, and, Billah, if we kill him now, they may not believe us when we say that he slew Tarzan and we took his life in punishment. But if we keep him alive until we are met with the friends of Tarzan, should it so befall that they overtake us, then we may say that we did hold him prisoner, that Tarzan's own people might mete out their vengeance to him, which would suit them better." "Thy words are not without wisdom," admitted Ibn Yad. "But suppose the Nasrani spoke lies concerning us, and said that it was we who slew Tarzan. Wouldst they not believe him above us?" "That be easily prevented," said the old man who had spoken before. "Let us cut his tongue out forthwith, that he may not bear false witness against us." "Wallah, thou hast it!" exclaimed Ibn Yad. "Billah, nay," cried Fard. "The better we treat him, the larger will be the reward that he will pay us." "We can wait until the last moment," said Ibn Yad, and we see that we are to lose him and our reward. Then may we cut out his tongue." Thus the fate of Wilbur Stimble was left to the gods, and Ibn Jad, temporarily freed from the menace of Tarzan, turned his attention once more to his plans for entering the valley. With a strong party he went in person and sought a palaver with the Gala chief, Xiai. As he approached the village of Batando, he passed through the camps of thousands of Gala warriors and realized fully what he had previously sensed, but vaguely, that his position was most precarious, and that with the best grace possible, he must agree to whatever terms the old chief might propose. Batando received him graciously enough, though with all the majesty of a powerful monarch, and assured him that on the following day he would escort him to the entrance to the valley, but that first he must deliver to Batando all the Gala slaves that were with his party. "But that will leave us without carriers or servants, and will greatly weaken the strength of my party," cried Ibn Jad. Batando but shrugged his black shoulders. "Let them remain with us until we have returned from the valley," implored the sheikh. "No Gala man may accompany you," said Batando with finality. Early the next morning, the tent of Ibn Jad was struck in signal that all were to prepare for the Rahla, and entirely surrounded by Gala warriors, they started toward the rugged mountains where lay the entrance to the valley of Ibn Jad's dreams. Feijuan and the other Gala slaves that the Arab had brought with them from Beled el Guad marched with their own people, happy in their newfound freedom. Stimble, friendless, fearful, utterly cowed, trudged wearily along under guard of two young Bedouins, his mind constantly reverting to the horror of the murdered man lying in his lonely grave behind them. Winding steadily upward along what at times appeared to be an ancient trail and again no trail at all, the Arab and their escort climbed higher and higher into the rugged mountains that rim the valley of the Sepulchre upon the north. At the close of the second day, after they had made camp beside a rocky mountain brook, Batando came to Ibn Jad and pointed to the entrance to a rocky side ravine that branched from the main canyon directly opposite the camp. "There," he said, "lies the trail into the valley. Here we leave you and return to our villages. Upon the morrow we go." When the sun rose the following morning, Ibn Jad discovered that the Galas had departed during the night, but he did not know it was because of the terror they felt for the mysterious inhabitants of the mysterious valley from which no Gala ever had returned. That day Ibn Jad spent in making a secure camp in which to leave the women and children until the warriors had returned from their adventure in the valley, or had discovered that they might safely fetch their women. And the next morning, leaving a few old men and boys to protect the camp, he set forth with those who were accounted the fighting men among them, and presently the watchers in the camp saw the last of them disappear in the rocky ravine that lay opposite the Menzil. Chapter 16. The Great Tourney. King Bohun, with many knights and squires and serving men, had ridden down from his castle above the city of the Sepulchre 2 days ago to make his way across the valley to the field before the city of Nimr for the great tourney that is held once each year, commencing upon the first Sunday in Lent. Gay pennons fluttered from 1,000 lance tips, and gay with color were the housings of the richly caparisoned chargers that proudly bore the knights of the Sepulchre, upon whose backs red crosses were emblazoned to denote that they had completed the pilgrimage to the Holy Land and were returning to home and England. Their bassinets, unlike those of the knights of Nimr, were covered with bullock hide, and the devices upon their bucklers differed, and their colors. But for these and the crosses upon their backs, they might have been Gobred's own good knights and true. Sturdy sumpter beasts, almost as richly trapped as the knights' steeds, bore the marquees and tilts that were to house the knights during the tourney, as well as their personal belongings, their extra arms and their provisions, for the 3 days of the tourney. For custom over 7 centuries old, forbade the knights of Nimr and the knights of the Sepulchre breaking bread together. The great tourney was merely a truce during which they carried on their ancient warfare under special rules, which transformed it into a gorgeous pageant and an exhibition of martial prowess which non-combatants might witness in comfort and with impunity. It did not permit friendly intercourse between the two factions, as this was not compatible with the seriousness of the event, in which knights of both sides often were killed, or the spirit in which the grand prize was awarded. This prize, as much as any other factor, had kept open the breach of 7.5 centuries' duration that separated the fronters from the backers, for it consisted of 5 maidens whom the winners took back with them to their own city, and who were never again seen by their friends or relatives. Though the sorrow was mitigated by the honorable treatment that custom and the laws of knighthood decreed should be accorded these unfortunate maidens, it was still bitter because attached to it was the sting of defeat. Following the tournament, the maidens became the especial charges of go-bread or bohun, dependent, of course, upon whether the honors of the tourney had fallen to the fronters or the backers, and in due course were given in honorable marriage to knights of the victorious party. The genesis of the custom, which was now fully 7 centuries old, doubtless lay in the wise desire of some ancient go-bread or bohun to maintain the stock of both factions strong and virile by the regular infusion of new blood, as well, perhaps, as to prevent the inhabitants of the two cities from drifting too far apart in manners, customs, and speech. Many a happy wife of Nimr had been born in the city of the Sepulchre, and seldom was it that the girls themselves repined for long. It was considered an honor to be chosen, and there were always many more who volunteered than the requisite number of 5 that annually made the sacrifice. The 5 who constituted the prize offered by the city of the Sepulchre this year rode on white palfreys and were attended by a guard of honor in silver mail. The girls, selected for their beauty to thus honor the city of their birth, were gorgeously attired and weighed down with ornaments of gold and silver and precious stones. Upon the plain before the city of Nimr, preparations for the tourney had been in progress for many days. The lists were being dragged and rolled with heavy wooden rollers. The ancient stands of stone from which the spectators viewed the spectacle were undergoing their annual repairs and cleansing. A frame superstructure was being raised to support the canopies that would shade the choice seats reserved for the nobility, and staffs for 1,000 pennons had been set around the outer margin of the lists. These and 100 other things were occupying a company of workmen, and in the walled city and in the castle that stood above it, the hammers of armorers and smiths rang far into the night, forging iron shoes and mail and lance tips. Blake had been assured that he was to have a part in the great tourney, and was as keen for it as he had been for the big game of the season during his football days at college. He had been entered in 2 sword contests, one in which 5 knights of Nimr met 5 knights of the Sepulchre, and another in which he was pitted against a single antagonist. But his only contest with the lance was to be in the grand finale, when 100 fronters faced 100 backers, since, whereas, before his encounter with Malud, he had been considered hopeless with sword and buckler, now Prince Gobred looked to him to win many points with these, his lance work being held but mediocre. King Bohun and his followers were camped in a grove of oaks about a mile north of the lists, nor did the laws governing the great tourney permit them to come nearer until the hour appointed for their entrance upon the first day of the spectacle. Blake, in preparing for the tourney, had followed the custom adopted by many of the knights of wearing distinctive armor and trapping his charger similarly. His chainmail was all of solid black, relieved only by the leopard skin of his bassinet, and the blue and silver pennon upon his lance. The housings of his mount were of black, edged with silver and blue, and there were, of course, the prescribed red crosses upon his breast and upon his horse housings. As he came from his quarters upon the opening morning of the tourney, followed by Edward bearing his lance and buckler, he appeared a somber figure among the resplendently caparisoned knights and the gorgeously dressed women that were gathered in the great court, awaiting the word to mount their horses, which were being held in the north ballium by the grooms. That his black mail was distinctive was evidenced by the attention he immediately attracted, and that he had quickly become popular among the knights and ladies of Nimmer was equally apparent by the manner in which they clustered about him, but opinion was divided in the matter of his costume, some holding that it was too dismal and depressing. Guinalda was there, but she remained seated upon a bench where she was conversing with one of the maidens that had been chosen as Nimmer's prize. Blake quickly disengaged himself from those who had crowded about him and crossed the court to where Guinalda sat. At his approach, the princess looked up and inclined her head slightly in recognition of his bow, and then she resumed her conversation with the maiden. The rebuff was too obvious to permit of misunderstanding, but Blake was not satisfied to accept it and go his way without an explanation. He could scarce believe, however, that the princess was still vexed, merely because he had intimated that he had believed that she took a greater interest in him than she had admitted. There must be some other reason. He did not turn and walk away then, although she continued to ignore him, but stood quietly before her, waiting patiently until she should again notice him. Presently he noted that she was becoming nervous, as was also the maiden with whom she spoke. There were lapses in their conversation. One of Guinalda's feet was tapping the flagging irritably. A slow flush was creeping upward into her cheeks. The maiden fidgeted. She plucked at the ends of the wimple that lay about her shoulders. She smoothed the rich cyclers of her mantle, and finally she arose and, bowing before the princess, asked if she might go and bid farewell to her mother. Guinalda bade her begone, and then, alone with Blake and no longer able to ignore him, nor caring to, she turned angrily upon him. "I was right," she snapped. "Thou beest a forward boor. Why standeth thou thus staring at me when I have made it plain that I wouldst not be annoyed by thee? Go." "Because—" Blake hesitated. "Because I love you." "Sirrah!" cried Guinalda, springing to her feet. "How darest thou?" "I would dare anything for you, my princess," replied Blake, "because I love you." Guinalda looked straight at him for a moment in silence, then her short upper lip curved in a contemptuous sneer. "Thou liest," she said. "I have heard what thou hast said concerning me." And without waiting for a reply, she brushed past him and walked away. Blake hurried after her. "What have I said about you?" he demanded. "I have said nothing that I would not repeat before all Nimmer. Not even have I presumed to tell my best friend, Sir Richard, that I love you. Not other ears than yours have heard that." "I have heard differently," said Guinalda haughtily, "and I care not to discuss the matter further." "But," commenced Blake, but at that instant a trumpet sounded from the north gate leading into the ballium. It was the signal for the knights to mount. Guinalda's page came running to her to summon her to her father's side. Sir Richard appeared and seized Blake by the arm. "Come, James," he cried. "We should have been mounted before now, for we ride in the forerank of the knights today." And so Blake was dragged away from the princess before he could obtain an explanation of her, to him, inexplicable attitude. The North Ballium presented a scene of color and activity, crowded as it was with knights and ladies, pages, squires, grooms, men-at-arms, and horses, nor would it accommodate them all, so that the overflow stretched into the east and south balliums, and even through the great east gate, out upon the road that leads down into the valley. For half an hour, something very like chaos reigned about the castle of the Prince of Nimmer. But eventually, perspiring marshals and shouting heralds whipped the cortege into shape as it took its slow and imposing way down the winding mountain road toward the lists. First rode the marshals and heralds, and behind them a score of trumpeters. Then came Prince Gobred riding alone, and following was a great company of knights, their colored pennons streaming in the wind. They rode just before the ladies, and behind the ladies was another company of knights, while in the rear marched company after company of men-at-arms, some armed with crossbows, others with pikes, and still others again with battle-axes of huge proportions. Perhaps 100 knights and men-at-arms, all told, were left behind to guard the castle and the entrance to the Valley of the Sepulchre. But these would be relieved to witness the second and third day's exercises. As the Knights of Nimmer wound down to the lists, the Knights of the Sepulchre moved out from their camp among the oaks, and the marshals of the two parties timed their approach so that both entered the lists at the same time. The ladies of Nimir dropped out of the procession and took their places in the stand. The 5 maidens of Nimr and the 5 from the city of the Sepulchre were escorted to a dais at one end of the lists, after which the knights lined up in solid ranks, the Knights of Nimr upon the south side of the lists, the Knights of the Sepulchre upon the north. Gobred and Bohun rode forward and met in the center of the field, where, in measured and imposing tones, Bohun delivered the ancient challenge prescribed by custom and the laws of the great Tourney, and handed Gobred the gage, the acceptance of which constituted an acceptance of the challenge and marked the official opening of the tourney. As Gobred and Bohun reined about and faced their own knights, these rode out of the lists, those who were not to take part in the encounters of the day seeking places in the stands after turning their chargers over to grooms, while those who were to participate formed again to ride once around the lists, for the double purpose of indicating to their opponents and the spectators the entrance for that day, and of viewing the prizes offered by their opponents. In addition to the maidens, there were many minor prizes consisting of jeweled ornaments, suits of mail, lances, swords, bucklers, splendid steeds, and the many articles that were valued by knights, or that might find favor in the eyes of their ladies. The Knights of the Sepulchre paraded first, with Bohun at their head, and it was noticeable that the eyes of the king were often upon the women in the stands as he rode past. Bohun was a young man, having but just ascended the throne following the recent death of his father. He was arrogant and tyrannical, and it had been common knowledge in Nimr that for years he had been at the head of a faction that was strong for war with Nimr, that the city might be reduced and the entire Valley of the Sepulchre brought under the rule of the Bohuns. His charger prancing, his colors flying, his great company of knights at his back, King Bohun rode along the stands reserved for the people of Nimr, and when he came to the central lodge in which sat Prince Gobred with the Princess Brunilda and Princess Gwynalda, his eyes fell upon the face of the daughter of Gobred. Bohun reined in his charger and stared straight into the face of Gwynalda. Gobred flushed angrily, for Bohun's act was a breach of courtesy, and half rose from his seat. But at that moment Bohun, bowing low across his mount's withers, moved on, followed by his knights. That day the honors went to the Knights of the Sepulchre, for they scored 227 points against 106 that the Knights of Nimr were able to procure. Upon the second day the tourney opened with the riding past of the entrants, who ordinarily were conducted by a herald, but to the surprise of all, Bohun again led his knights past the stands, and again he paused and looked full at the Princess Gwynalda. This day the Knights of Nimr fared a little better, being for the day but 7 points behind their opponents, though the score for the 2 days stood 269 to 397, in favor of the Knights of the Sepulchre. So the third day opened with the knights from the north, boasting what seemed an insuperable lead of 128 points, and the Knights of Nimmer spurred to greater action by the knowledge that to win the tourney they must score 232 of the remaining 334 points. Once again, contrary to age-old custom, Bohun led his entrants about the lists as they paraded before the opening encounter, and once again he drew rein before the Loge of Gobred, and his eyes rested upon the beautiful face of Gwynalda for an instant before he addressed her sire. "Prince Gobred of Nimmer," he said in his haughty and arrogant voice, "as you well know, my valiant sir knights have bested thine by more than 60 points, and the great tourney be as good as ours already. Yet we would make thee a proposition. Speak, Bohun, the great tourney is yet far from won, but an ye have any proposition that an honorable prince may consider, thou hast my assurance that 'twill be given consideration." "Thy 5 maidens are as good as ours," said Bohun, "but give me thy daughter to be queen of the Valley of the Sepulchre, and I will grant thee the tourney." Gobred went white with anger, but when he replied his voice was low and even, for he was master of his own emotions, as befitted a princely man. "Sir Bohun," he said, refusing to accord to his enemy the title of king, "thy words are an offense in the ears of honorable men, implying as they do that the daughter of a Gobred be for sale, and that the honor of the knighthood of Nimmer may be bartered for. Get thee hence to thine own side of the lists, before I set serfs upon ye to drive ye there with staves." "So that be thine answer, eh?" shouted Bohun. "Then know ye that I shall take the 5 maidens by the rules of the great tourney, and thy daughter by force of arms." With this threat delivered, he wheeled his steed and spurred away. Word of Bohun's proposition and his rebuff spread like wildfire throughout the ranks of the Knights of Nimmer, so that those who were to contend this last day of the tourney were keyed to the highest pitch of derring-do in the defense of the honor of Nimmer and the protection of the Princess Gwynalda. The great lead attained by the Knights of the Sepulchre during the first 2 days was but an added incentive to greater effort, provoking them as a spur to the utmost limits of daring and exertion. There was no need that their marshals should exhort them. The youth and chivalry of Nimmer had heard the challenge and would answer it in the lists. Blake's sword and buckler encounter with a Knight of the Sepulchre was scheduled for the first event of the day. When the lists were cleared, he rode in to a fanfare of trumpets, moving parallel with the south stands, while his adversary rode along the front of the north stands, the latter halting before the Loge of Bohun, as Blake drew rein in front of that of Gobred, where he raised the hilt of his sword to his lips to the prince, though his eyes were upon Gwynalda. "Conduct thyself as a true knight this day, to the glory and honor of Nimmer," charged Gobred. "And may the blessings of our Lord Jesus be upon thee and thy sword, our well-beloved Sir James. To the glory and honor of Nimmer I pledge my sword and my life," should have been Blake's reply according to the usages of the great tourney. "To the glory and honor of Nimmer and to the protection of my princess, I pledge my sword and my life," is what he said, and it was evident from the expression on Gobred's face that he was not displeased, while the look of haughty disdain which had been upon Gwynalda's face softened. Slowly she arose and, tearing a ribbon from her gown, stepped to the front of the loge. "Receive this favor from thy lady, Sir Knight," she said, "bearing it with honor and to victory in thy encounter." Blake reined close to the rail of the loge and bent low while Gwynalda pinned the ribbon upon his shoulder. His face was close to hers. He sensed the intoxicating perfume of her hair. He felt her warm breath upon his cheek. I love you, he whispered, so low that no other ears than hers could hear. Thou art a boor, she replied in a voice as low as his. It be for the sake of the 5 maidens that I encourage ye with this favor. Blake looked straight into her eyes. I love you, Ginalda, he said, and you love me. Before she could reply, he had wheeled away. The trumpets had sounded, and he was cantering slowly towards the end of the field where the tilts of the knights of Nimmer stood. Edward, very much excited, was there, and Sir Richard and Meikle, with a marshal, heralds, trumpeters, men-at-arms, a martial company to urge him on with encouragement and advice. Blake cast aside his buckler, nor was there any to reprove him now. Instead, they smiled proudly and knowingly, for had they not seen him best, Sir Malud, without other defense than his horsemanship and his sword? The trumpets blared again. Blake turned and put spurs to his charger. Straight down the center of the lists he rode. From the opposite end came a knight of the sepulchre to meet him. Sir James, cried the spectators in the stands upon the south side, while the north stands answered with the name of their champion. Who is the Black Knight? Asked many a man in the north stands of his neighbor. He hath no buckler, cried some. He be mad. Sir Guy wilt cleave him open at the first pass. Sir Guy, Sir Guy.